Thank you.
Thank you.
Looking forward to the debate.
We are too. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for judging us.
Absolutely. We really appreciate it. Thank you all for being here.
And just so you know, NCFCA has sent us all of the judging philosophies that you guys typed out. So we have those and we've already reviewed them.
All right, excellent. And it looks like all of our judges are now here. And just to confirm, before we get introductions started, all 5 of our judges can hear us all right? Perfect, excellent. All right, then I believe we can go ahead and get started. I'll kick this off. My name is Zacarias Negron, and I will be your first affirmative speaker within today's round. Thank you all again for being here. We really appreciate it.
My name is Thaddeus Burson, and I will be your second affirmative speaker. Thank you all for taking your time to judge us.
My name is Claire Say, and I'll be the first negative speaker in today's debate round.
And my name is Danielle Miller. I'll be your second negative speaker today. Thank you all so much for judging.
All right, then with that being said, I believe my partner and I will reintroduce ourselves since we're using the same screen throughout today's debate round. So I am Zacarias Negron. My name matches the screen. I'm your first affirmative speaker. And whenever Ms. Say and Ms. Miller, you are ready? Perfect. And all 5 of our judges. Excellent. Then with 8 minutes on the clock, I believe we can go ahead and get started. Quote, "It is legally irresponsible to deport people back to a country still actively at war. It is morally unsustainable for EU member states to deport migrants protected under international refugee law while claiming to be built from a foundation respecting and upholding international human rights. Forcing Afghanistan to take people back seeking asylum in the EU territory reveals complicity toward the slaughter of innocent humans, something Europe pledged never to let happen," end quote. It's because doctoral researcher at the University of Vienna, Mirwais Wakil, accurately identified in June of 2018 the unfortunate reality of the EU's misguided response to Afghan refugees that my partner and I stand resolved. The European Union should substantially reform its immigration policy. Now, before we reach the core of our argumentation, it's critical to understand one central facet. The EU deports thousands to Afghanistan. To understand the complex reality of the EU and its member states' response to Afghan migrants, we're going to examine 2 core subpoints. Firstly, subpoint A, misdefining Afghanistan. In 2016, the EU covertly signed a deal with the Afghan government, known as the Joint Way Forward, or JWF. In effect, this deal opened the gateway for EU member states to deport migrants back to Afghanistan. Soraya Sahar, Samira Shifte, and Aruj Rahman wrote in September of 2017 that, quote, "The EU-Afghanistan Joint Way Forward, or JWF, allows EU member states to deport an unlimited number of Afghan asylum seekers by classifying them as economic migrants rather than refugees, and obliges the Afghan government to receive them. Thanks to a leaked memo, it's widely known to have been a backroom deal that Afghanistan was forced to accept in order to receive humanitarian aid. It rests as well on the false presumption that Afghanistan is safe to deport people to, when all recent reports indicate an alarming rate of violence," end quote. Quite simply, the EU strong-armed Afghanistan into taking its asylum seekers back. Further, the EU justifies these deportations by misdefining Afghanistan as, quote-unquote, safe. In essence, they reject asylum seekers' applications for refuge because Afghanistan is safe. I'd like you to notate that word safe in quotation marks on your flow. This mere grammatical change provides for a devastating result in that migrants who actually qualify for protection are rejected and unjustly returned to Afghanistan. These member states reject asylum applications and unjustly return migrants on the unfounded claim that Afghanistan is a safe country. This distortion of reality leads us to subpoint B, thousands deported. After reporting the tragic story of a returned Afghan refugee named Mortaza, Agnieszka Piguliko-Wilczewska wrote in May of 2020 that, quote, "Mortaza's story is an all too familiar one to thousands of Afghan migrants, as over the past several years, deportations have become the norm. Most European countries consider Afghanistan a safe country, despite the evidence to the contrary," end quote. Estimates reach as high as 20,000 migrants who've been deported to Afghanistan from 2015 to 2020 alone, according to Deutsche Welle, a German news publication. These numbers represent thousands of individuals who've been returned to a nation characterized by rampant violence, terrorism, and war. Because my partner and I believe that a practice that unjustly places individuals in grave danger must not continue, we present the following plan. Plan, suspend deportations to Afghanistan. Our first mandate is to suspend deportations to Afghanistan. The European Commission will propose, and Parliament and Council of the EU enact, a regulation suspending all deportations to Afghanistan and terminating the renewed iteration of the EU-Afghanistan Joint Way Forward, entitled the Joint Declaration on Migration Cooperation, JDMC. Aid is unaffected. Our second mandate is to protect Afghan asylum seekers. Additionally, the regulation in Mandate 1 requires that EU member states grant a minimum of subsidiary protection to all Afghans who apply for asylum for the duration of this suspension. These mandates have two exceptions. Firstly, any migrant who has been or is convicted of a violent crime as defined by the EU Statistics Office, Eurostat. And second, any migrant deported for the purpose of facing judicial proceedings in Afghanistan. Our enforcement is the EU Commission, Council, and Parliament, and any other necessary bodies. No funding will be needed for this plan as it is purely legislative, and the timeline begins immediately following an affirmative ballot. In brief explanation, this plan ends unjustified deportations to Afghanistan and grants Afghan asylum seekers subsidiary protection. Subsidiary protection is simply a legal protection for migrants who are currently unreturnable that enables them to contribute to European society while they stay in Europe. My partner and I believe this plan to be necessary and justified under three grounds. Firstly, justification 1, unsurpassed violence. A study by Dr. Friedrich Stallman, a social scientist and leading Afghan expert, along with 3 other organizations, published in June of 2021, just 2 weeks ago, quote, Afghanistan has led various international rankings of violence for several years. The Global Peace Index at the Institute for Economics and Peace lists Afghanistan in 2020, as it did in 2019, as the most dangerous country in the world. As in 2018 and 2019, this year, Afghanistan was the country with the most documented worldwide deaths. Further, the International Committee of the Red Cross continues to rate Afghanistan as the most dangerous country for civilians in the world, end quote. A wide array of bodies, from NGOs to academics to think tanks and governmental agencies, have identified the unsurpassed levels of violence in Afghanistan. Asylum seekers deported to Afghanistan face evident and immense risks to their lives and livelihoods. To deport migrants, heedless of the evidence and danger that they're placed in, is fundamentally immoral. But further, it's an undoubted breach of EU law. And this leads us to justification 2, unlawful deportations. A fundamental and legally binding principle of EU law is the principle of non-refoulement. This principle establishes that no EU member state or EU executive agency may deport any individual to another nation where they face risk of death or human rights violations. To deport to Afghanistan is a textbook violation of this principle. Amnesty International published in October of 2018 that, quote, at present, given the grave security and human rights situation across the country, all returns to Afghanistan constitute refoulement. European governments have remained willfully blind to the dangers to which returnees are exposed. Prioritizing deportations, heedless of evidence, is reckless and illegal, end quote. Deporting migrants to a country of such unparalleled insecurity and violence is in complete and evident contravention of human rights and EU domestic law. Further, these deportations fall short of addressing the core issues and come at the cost of millions of taxpayer euros. And this leads us to justification 3, unrealistic policy. Abdul Ghaffur, the founder of Afghanistan Migrants Advice and Support Organization, explained the cyclical nature of deportations in May of 2020, saying, quote, the cycle does not end. Deportees leave again illegally and not necessarily directly to Europe. The environment does not encourage people to stay in Afghanistan. They spend a lot of money and risk their lives again. The only difference is that if a person was deported from Sweden, this time they go back to Germany. Deporting a migrant back to Afghanistan is often simply a cyclical process. Many Afghans are forced to flee again, even to the EU. Further, deportations require immense economic resources and eliminate economic opportunity. In fact, a study authored by Dr. Yuri Dadush, a senior fellow at the OCP Policy Center, published by the World Bank in October of 2017, found that considering the fiscal, economic, and labor market impact of deporting migrants is not in the economic interests of most advanced nations. At its core, these deportations are costly, cyclical, and counterintuitive. These deportations are evidently impractical. The EU must not continue in a practice that is morally corrupt, legally unsound, and practically unfounded. In ending these individuals, the EU and migrants are better. Thank you. I now stand ready for any questions the negative side may have.
3 minutes on the clock.
Absolutely.
Let's get started. First off, could you please pass us back a copy of your 1AC?
Absolutely.
Where in the EU treaties is the EU allowed to ban all deportations to a country?
Article 79 and Article 78 pertaining to Mandate 2. And actually, we can look to current precedent. The EU has already banned all deportations to countries that are labeled unsafe. However, that leaves an arbitrary loophole because countries are allowed to say, well, we think Afghanistan is safe. Our plan goes the extra step and actually defines the perimeters and defines Afghanistan.
So just to be clear, the EU has never been able to specifically label a country as unsafe or specifically label a country as one where deportations cannot occur.
I'm sorry, Ms. Miller, that's not what I said. I actually said that the EU currently has a ban in place for all deportations to countries that are deemed unsafe. However, that is a very ambiguous term. What our plan does is it sets strict parameters across that, further following under constitutional requirements in Article 79 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union.
Okay, so is deporting people to Afghanistan illegal?
Deporting people to Afghanistan would be illegal under the principle of refoulement. However, there is a loophole in that member states can say, well, we think Afghanistan might be safe, so we're sending them there because we get to define what's safe and unsafe. What our plan does is it takes away that arbitrary definition and places Afghanistan as where deportations are banned.
Are all Afghans deported?
Not all Afghans are deported, but I don't believe
What
that any.
percentage?
We have a number of 20,000 Afghans being deported, 20,000 lives.
You know what percentage that is?
You can always make a number look small by comparing it to another number. 20,000 lives is most certainly significant.
Okay, so you agree that member states are deporting a significant amount of people?
I would say that member states are deporting a significant amount of people, yes.
Why do member states deport Afghans?
Well, member states deport Afghans for several different reasons. One reason that has been expounded upon by various human rights experts has been that the EU is currently involved in the war in Afghanistan under NATO forces. And deporting people to Afghanistan would give the false assumption or organized hypocrisy, as some have called it, that the EU is succeeding in their mission in Afghanistan because it's quote unquote safe enough to send people back to. However, all
so
the contrary.
you'd agree that member states have a strong desire to deport people to Afghanistan, correct?
Perhaps, but NATO is now pulling out as of just a few days ago.
Why do most people flee Afghanistan?
Unsurpassed levels of violence.
So the number one reason for people fleeing Afghanistan is violence.
I would say that the most recent evidence points to the fact that Afghanistan is the most dangerous country in the world and that people, compounded with likely other reasons, flee for their lives.
Okay, that wasn't my question. My question was, is the number one reason people flee Afghanistan violence?
It would be my argumentation that yes, they do. But even if they're not fleeing from violence, we should not be sending people back to a country where their lives are incontrovertibly put in danger.
Is Syria actively at war?
Syria is at war. Afghanistan is more dangerous than Syria and Yemen combined as of 2 weeks ago.
Thank you. The negative team will be taking prep time. We have 5 minutes on the clock, starting now.
All right, no further prep time needed. We have 3 minutes and 30 seconds remaining. All right, I have 8 minutes on my timer, and I'll get started. I'd like to start off by reframing exactly what we're talking about the situation in Afghanistan. So I'd like to start off by mentioning that while the affirmative team read you a lot of evidence how Afghanistan is a very dangerous country, and I would agree, Afghanistan is pretty dangerous to live there. However, I think the affirmative team is creating you this picture that being sent to Afghanistan is fundamentally a death sentence. And that is not the case. So you can write down my first background point is many fleeing for economic reasons. Many fleeing for economic reasons. According to Stephanie Glinsky on the New Humanitarian on June 2nd of 2021, quote, in 2018, some 250,000 people fled their homes as waters ran dry. Farmers left behind parched fields and herders sold off livestock at a fraction of their costs. At one point during the year, the drought displaced more people than Afghanistan's enduring conflict, end quote. What this is basically saying is that not everyone is fleeing Afghanistan due to the violence there. Now, I'm not saying, again, that Afghanistan is the safest country ever. However, I am saying that the affirmative team's picture that they've painted you is not entirely accurate. That many people fleeing Afghanistan are fleeing for economic reasons, because there was a drought in 2018, and at one point, it even surpassed the number of people fleeing due to violence. So not everyone is necessarily fleeing because they're facing a conflict or the threat of the Taliban. Leads me to my second background point, that of not most dangerous country. Not the most dangerous country. I can't speak for how different organizations form their ranking mechanisms for how countries are ranked most dangerous to least dangerous. However, I can tell you that just off the top of my mind, in Yemen, there are massive atrocities. Hunger is being used as a weapon of war. People are being bombed continuously. Civilians are dying. For example, in South Sudan, there's ethnic cleansing going on right now. In China, according to your definition of genocide, genocide is being committed against the Uyghur Muslim population there. To be clear, the affirmative team is granting blanket amnesty to basically an entire region of the world. This is a very substantial policy that has dramatic implications for the relationship between the EU and their member states. But I would like to clarify that, again, not everyone is fleeing due to violence. Afghanistan is not the most dangerous country in the world. Again, I'm not saying that Afghanistan isn't dangerous, and for those deported to very dangerous parts of Afghanistan unjustly, that is very sad. However, as we'll be seeing in my next point, that problem is actually being solved right now. That leads me to my first significance point, which is court ruling. Court ruling. My first subpoint you can write down as stops dangerous deportations. Stops dangerous deportations. Now, according to Info Migrants on June 11th of 2021, so just a couple weeks ago, quote, asylum authorities in European countries should examine all the relevant circumstances in the country of origin of those fleeing armed conflict before deciding whether to grant them protection, according to Europe's highest court. In a case concerning 2 Afghan nationals, the European Court of Justice ruled on Thursday, June 10th, that the test Germany had used to determine the level of risk faced by the applicants was too narrow. The 2 men had applied for protection but were rejected by German authorities because of the death toll in their region was too low. German authorities assess each person's right to subsidiary protection by calculating the ratio between the number of civilian casualties and the total population of the area. According to this week's ruling, the test excluded people genuinely in need of protection, end quote. What this basically is saying is in the past couple of weeks, Europe's highest court ruled in favor of Afghan nationals, forcing member states to grant greater protection to people deserving of it. They're taking into account that principle of non-refoulement, which means is more understandable given, again, the number of people fleeing due to economic reasons and, again, the people fleeing due to violence. The people sincerely justified in their asylum applications will be protected under this new court ruling, which leads me to my second subpoint. Does justice to Afghans? And this is according to a human rights organization. Again, from Info Migrants on June 11th. Quote, the human rights organization Pro-Asile welcomed the ECJ ruling as groundbreaking, as it means that Afghan nationals from some provinces may be more likely to be granted protection in the future. The previous case law in Germany never did justice to the situation in Afghanistan. Now, since the ECJ ruling, it will, said Pro-Asile legal report Peter von Auer, end quote. What this means is that this EU Court of Justice ruling will have substantial implications and will protect the people in need of protection from violence in Afghanistan. But that leads me to my second significance point: new, different policy. If you notice throughout their description of the harms about the EU's policy towards Afghanistan, they talked about the joint way forward. And that was our policy towards our policy with Afghanistan that we had for a long time. But recently, the EU actually signed a new policy. And this new policy is very significant in the different protections it gives to people being deported to Afghanistan. According to the EU delegation to the UN on June 4th, 2021, quote, "The joint declaration will help to address irregular migration and promote joint efforts in the fight against migrant smuggling and human trafficking, and will facilitate the sustainable reintegration of people returning to Afghanistan by focusing on their individual needs and the needs of host and return communities. In line with the new pact on migration and asylum, which places particular emphasis on strengthening partnerships between the EU and countries of origin and transit, the joint declaration brings significant improvements based on lessons learned from the implementation of the joint way forward, including a preference for the voluntary return of Afghan nationals, better protection for children, a clear definition of certain vulnerable groups, and clear definition of certain vulnerable groups," end quote. Basically, what this means is that the EU actually has implemented a new deal with Afghanistan, which fundamentally means is that the affirmative team's evidence about a harm is outdated. We have a new strategy in our relationship with Afghanistan and the situation of sending people back to Afghanistan. We're fundamentally implementing a new strategy. And all of the affirmative team's evidence, due to talking about a particular harm, is actually from about 2018. The only evidence I saw in their 1AC talking about evidence from 2021 was talking about the violence in Afghanistan. If they would like to clarify that, they can feel free to do that. But fundamentally, we've very recently, at the beginning of June, implemented a completely new program and coordination with Afghanistan to help protect people. Again, many people fleeing Afghanistan are economic migrants. Those truly fleeing violence will be protected by the EU Court of Justice ruling recently, as well as the new EU program and agreement with Afghanistan and the new implementation of our approach there. Fundamentally, the affirmative team has painted you a misleading picture, I believe unintentionally, of what the situation in Afghanistan is like. The EU is doing everything they can and should be doing to protect people truly in need of protection. Thank you.
All right, and if everyone can hear me, perfect. And whenever Ms. Say, you're ready?
Yes.
Excellent.
Thank
And absolutely. And whenever all of our judges are ready. Perfect. Then let me just confirm I have 3 minutes on the clock. I am the first affirmative speaker. I believe we can go ahead and get started. First of all, Ms. Say, congratulations on making it to Nationals and Nationals finals. I trust you're doing well. I'm just going to move into a couple of questions. Down the flow of your speech, you first mentioned that Afghanistan has a severe drought, correct?
They had a severe drought in 2018, and they're looking at another severe drought here soon as well.
Right. That evidence was from 2021, around a few weeks ago, right?
Correct.
From Stephanie Glinsky?
Yes.
Okay. That is a drought that is compounded with the already unsurpassed levels of violence in Afghanistan, correct? It didn't say that that was the #1 reason people were fleeing, but just that that is an exacerbated situation, correct?
No, it says, quote, in 2018, at one point during the year, the drought displaced more people than Afghanistan's enduring conflict.
Okay, in 2018, correct? We're in 2021, right?
I'm referring to historically the drought and the economic migration from Afghanistan.
Okay, we'd love to see some evidence from 2021 on that. Moving forward, you can agree, you talked about Afghanistan not being the most dangerous country in the world, right?
There are many extremely dangerous countries in the world.
Right, that was your point, correct?
Correct.
Okay, you brought up the country of Yemen, China, you brought up other countries, correct?
Correct.
Okay, we can agree that as of this year, Afghanistan is more dangerous than Syria and Yemen combined, right?
It depends on the evidence presented and how they came to that conclusion. There are many different ways of measuring how
Okay,
dangerous a country is.
Perhaps agree that there is international consensus that Afghanistan is the most dangerous country in the world for civilians by far.
I'd have to see evidence on that.
Okay. Moving forward, you turn to this court case. Can you agree that that court case has very weak language? It says that member states should examine the status in Afghanistan, correct?
I'm not speaking to the particular wording of the court case. I am speaking to the human rights organizations that said this will protect Afghans.
Excellent. We'll go to that in 1 second. But first of all, can you agree that that court case actually flows to the affirmative side? It established that the current test employed by one member state, Germany, was too narrow, saying that Afghanistan was safe. What our plan does is it establishes a new test. Afghanistan can't be deported to, right?
The court case implies that there is a harm that we never contested fully. However, the court case is protecting the people who need protection. And as my partner will be talking about in her next speech, there are many disadvantages to your blanket amnesty to an entire region of the world.
Okay, thank you. Can you agree that that group, Pro-Azil, actually said that it is more likely, not absolutely certain, that Afghans will be protected?
There's specific wording I don't think matters. It's that the EU Court of Justice is enforcing the law to protect Afghans.
I have 10 seconds left, so I'm going to get one more question out. That group, Pro-Azil, can you agree that as of 2 weeks ago, they actually advocated for a complete ban to Afghanistan, the group you cited?
I'd have to see evidence on that.
Thank you, Ms. Say.
All right, the affirmative team will start prep time at 5 minutes. Stopping affirmative prep time at 3 minutes and 48 seconds. Give me 1 moment to get up to the podium. All right, and just for clarity, my name is Thaddeus Burson. I am the second affirmative speaker. All right, if the negative team's ready?
Yes.
Great, sounds good. Then with 8 minutes on the clock, we can go ahead and get started. Quote, if the EU continues to repatriate Afghans under current circumstances, it would not only be risking their lives, but further eroding Europe's already crumbling image as a bastion of human rights, end quote. It's because my partner and I agree with Satara Mohammadi and Sajid Asghari in April of 2021 that we would ask you to vote for the affirmative side. In the second affirmative constructive of today's debate round, I'll be responding to the major contentions brought by the negative side. Yet before we examine those responses, giving you one further contention to clarify of the affirmative team. That is the contention of deporting to peril. Deporting to peril. We have to understand how these member states are continually deporting to a perilous nation of Afghanistan. We're going to see this in 3 subpoints. Subpoint A, Afghanistan is perilous. Afghanistan is perilous. A study published in June of 2021, just a couple weeks ago by Dr. Friedrich Stallman, a leading Afghanistan expert along with 3 other organizations, explained, quote, the sobering consequence of the development of this renewed civil war is that fighting must be expected in all provinces and in all places of Afghanistan. As in 2018 and 2019, in 2020, Afghanistan was the country with the absolute most documented war deaths worldwide. In 2019, this was more than Syria and Yemen combined. The International Committee of the Red Cross also continues to classify Afghanistan as the most dangerous country in the world for civilians, end quote. We have to understand that Afghanistan is the most dangerous country in the world. But this leads to subpoint B, monthly deportations. Monthly deportations. This is something that is continually occurring. Abdul Ghaffur explained in May of 2020 that, quote, in Sweden, each month or two, there is a charter flight bringing 30 or 40 people, usually in cooperation with Austria. Germany also deports regularly every month or two, end quote. So that just looks to 3 member states out of the 27 that are deporting dozens of Afghans every other month or so. The reality is this is a continual problem. But the question is, if this is so blatantly against EU law, how can these member states do it? Well, this leads to subpoint C, exploiting arbitrary requirements. Exploiting arbitrary requirements. The way the EU law stands right now is that it bans deporting to any unsafe nation. That's the principle of non-refoulement. And yet, EU member states, to circumvent this, say, well, Afghanistan's safe, and now we're not violating EU law. And unfortunately, they circumvent EU law. Amnesty International explained this in October of 2017 when they said, quote, to effect these returns, European countries have arbitrarily called some areas of Afghanistan safe, relying on the idea of an internal flight alternative. This concept is both legally questionable and, in the case of Afghanistan, factually unsound, end quote. What the affirmative team's change does is that it utilizes that same authority to ban deportations, but specifically on Afghanistan, not simply on an arbitrary idea. As such, we protect Afghan migrants and actually better the EU. But with that understood, we can jump into my responses to the negative team's contention. My main response is necessary plan. We have a necessary plan. There is a need in the status quo. And we're going to respond to each of her contentions in my subpoints. Subpoint A, protected regardless. Protected regardless. Now, she made the contention that the majority of these Afghans in 2018 were actually fleeing for economic reasons. Well, regardless of the intentions of the Afghans, when they flee from Afghanistan, they are protected under the principle of non-refoulement regardless. According to the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, as of 2018, quote, under international human rights law, the principle of non-refoulement applies to all migrants at all times, irrespective of migration status, end quote. The principle of non-refoulement applies to economic migrants and to refugees. No one is actually allowed to be deported to an unsafe nation. So regardless of whether or not they're deporting those with economic intentions or those fleeing this unsurpassed violence, they are protected under international and EU law. But further, this evidence was from 2018. And the reality is they haven't shown this drought coming in 2021. And further, because of these unsurpassed levels of violence, we see that Afghans are the second highest group applying for asylum in the European Union. We would contend that the majority are legitimate asylum seekers, but regardless, they are protected under EU law, and it is a violation of EU law to deport there. This leads to subpoint B, most dangerous country. Most dangerous country. Now, she made the contention that this was not the most dangerous country. I'd like to point out that she provided no evidence under this claim. She just relied upon personal knowledge to talk about Yemen and Syria. But the reality is, let's just look to 3 different sources. First, the Institute for Economics and Peace in 2020. They classified Afghanistan, ranking all countries in the world. Afghanistan came out to the least peaceful nation in the world. Let's look then to the International Red Cross. They rank Afghanistan as the most dangerous nation in the world for civilians. Then let's just look to blatant numbers. Afghanistan has the most civilian casualties, according to Dr. Friedrich Stallman in June of 2021, than any other nation in the world. The negative team has not presented a single part of evidence that Afghanistan is actually a safe nation, or even safer than Yemen and Syria. But even if we go to their exact examples that they pointed out, according to Dr. Friedrich Stallman in June of 2021, in 2019, Afghanistan had more civilian casualties than Yemen and Syria combined. Afghanistan is the most dangerous country in the world. The only evidence presented in today's debate round points exactly to that fact. We ought to end deportations to that nation. But this leads to subpoint C, still deporting. Still deporting. She explained that our plan wasn't really needed because the Court of Justice ruled against Germany's test techniques when evaluating Afghans' asylum systems. The unfortunate reality is that Germany and other member states are still deporting Afghan migrants. That ruling simply said that Germany had to change its test, not that they had to stop deporting. Interestingly, though, that ruling does support our case. They ruled that they unjustly deported these Afghan refugees and they need to change their practices. Unfortunately, however, we contend the ruling does not go far enough because member states are still allowed to deport to Afghanistan. We should suspend deportations in their entirety. Our plan is needed. But this leads to my next subpoint. JDMC worsens the situation. JDMC worsens the situation. She made the contention that as of last October, we switched from the JWF to the JDMC, and the JDMC has better protections for migrants. This is absolutely not the case. In fact, JDMC weakens the protection of migrants in the deal between the European Union and Afghanistan. The European Council on Refugees and Exiles, a group of over 100 non-governmental organizations, explained in February of 2021, quote, a new agreement called the Joint Declaration on Migration Cooperation, or JDMC, is set to be approved by the Council of the EU. There are some changes in the new agreement compared to the JWF, most of which reduce protection safeguards for individuals, particularly vulnerable groups, and introduces a set of measures that make it easier for member states to deport Afghan nationals at a time of increasing instability and deteriorating security situations in Afghanistan, end quote. So their contention that the JDMC all of a sudden solves the problem and eliminates the need for our plan is absolutely false. Our plan is necessary. The JDMC actually made the problem worse. This leads to my next subpoint, recent evidence. They also made the contention that in our 1AC, we only had 2018 evidence talking about the problem. I'd like to point to justification 3, which talked about how unrealistic these deportations are, that we deport in a cyclical process. That evidence was from 2020. Further, our unsurpassed violence evidence was also from 2021. But just to make sure that we're clear on the violation of international law, Medical International, which is a non-governmental organization, wrote in November of 2019, quote, out of the countries to which refugees are under no circumstances allowed to be deported, the entire world knows Afghanistan. Also well known is the fact that this does not prevent the German state and other EU member states from deporting there in obvious violation of human rights. Further, we can look to the European Council on Refugees and Exiles in March of 2021, when they said, quote, member states should halt deportations to Afghanistan due to the security situations in the country and the challenges that deportees face upon deportation to Afghanistan, end quote. So there is recent evidence of 2019, 2020, and 2021 talking about the security situation, how this is a violation of international law, and this is an unrealistic policy. Because this is a fiscally irresponsible and illegal policy, we would ask you to vote affirmative. Thank you.
Great. 3 minutes. I will get started. Does the EU have the responsibility to take in everyone in danger in the world?
Under international EU law, they have the responsibility to not deport them to a dangerous nation.
All right, so if anyone from a dangerous country comes to the EU, it's the EU's responsibility to take them in and care for them.
If it would be a violation of the principle of non-refoulement, that's already in EU law, yes.
What's the purpose of subsidiary protection?
The purpose of subsidiary protection is to protect those who can currently not be returned to their country of origin.
All right, is subsidiary protection a form of international protection?
It's a legal status that can be granted by member states.
Okay. Are there any times when deportations to Afghanistan would be justified?
Under
Excluding
our
criminals, sorry.
Regarding our 2 exceptions, if we're excluding those, no. Deportations to Afghanistan put lives in danger and violate EU law.
So there's no places in Afghanistan that are safe?
In fact, I actually read evidence from June of 2021 that said in all places in Afghanistan, there will be fighting to be expected. Further, we can look to Amnesty International and the US State Department in 2021 that says all places in Afghanistan are unsafe. So yes.
Okay, so where do the 31 million people that live in Afghanistan live?
In an unsafe nation.
So all of them are at threat of dying every day, all the time?
Certainly, absolutely. They are at threat to their lives. That's why we see so many people fleeing from Afghanistan to Iran, Pakistan, and the EU.
Okay. How many people live in Syria right now?
I'm not sure.
And Yemen?
Again, I'm not sure.
Okay. How many civilian casualties were there in Afghanistan in 2020?
I can send you the exact evidence talking about civilian casualties if you want.
Sure, I would appreciate that.
In 2019, it was more than Syria and Yemen combined.
True. Okay, if you could send me the specific number, I would really appreciate that. Finally, how does the Institute for Economics and Peace make their rankings of the unsafe and safe countries?
So we can send you the methodology for that study if you'd like.
Sure, and could you send me the one for the Red Cross as well?
Absolutely, we can send you the quote for that. I'll look if we have the methodology on the Red Cross study as well.
Okay, could you quickly explain the methodology for the Institute for Economics and Peace, please?
I actually don't have it up here with me, but we can send it back to you, back to the table.
Okay, thank you, no further questions. The negative team will be taking some of our 3 minutes and 30 seconds of prep time remaining, starting now.
And for the prep time needed, we have 1 minute and 24 seconds remaining. This will be an 8-minute speech, and I'll go ahead and get started. I'd like to take you back to my last cross-examination where 3 main things happened. First off, the affirmative team admitted that member states have a strong desire to deport people to Afghanistan. Second off, they admitted that deporting people to Afghanistan is currently illegal. And finally, they admitted that in the current system, member states have been able to find loopholes in order to break this law, that this strong desire has motivated them to find ways around something that is clearly against the law. This is not just the problem in the current system. This is going to be the problem that continues after the affirmative team's plan is passed. And the only thing that the affirmative team is going to do is to harm other migrants other than Afghans, to extend this problem to everyone else. In this speech, I'm going to be covering just the disadvantages of the affirmative team's case. And in my partner's speech, she's going to be going back and responding to each of those points you heard in the 2AC. So my first disadvantage, you can write down as increased pushbacks. That's increased pushbacks. My subpoint A under this, you can write down as member states break law. That's member states break law. One thing we both agree on is that member states are absolutely fine with blatantly disobeying EU law. And they're able to do this in a way that allows them to find loopholes around what is set out in EU law, for example, the principle of non-refoulement. So we've established that, and now we need to establish if they are able to find a loophole around the affirmative team's plan. So you can write down my subpoint B as easy loophole. That's easy loophole. And this is where we get to those pushbacks. So what a pushback is, it's an absolutely illegal practice where a member state, instead of taking someone's asylum application, so when they try to cross the border, they simply push them back over the border. They force them to leave their country and never process that asylum application in the first place. They never find out if they're from Afghanistan or from Syria, or if they're fleeing violence, or if they're an economic migrant. They simply make them leave. And this is actually a really widespread practice in the EU. You can write this down as pushbacks standard policy. That's pushbacks standard policy. This is according to the Committee on Migration, Refugees, and Displaced Persons of the Council of Europe in June 8th of 2019, excuse me. It says, quote, in this context, refusals of entry and expulsions without any individual assessment of protection needs have become a documented phenomenon at Europe's borders, as well as on the territory of member states further inland. As these practices are widespread and in some countries even take on a systematic character, those pushbacks can be considered as part of a national policy rather than incidental measures. Pushbacks take place in particular at European Union borders, which is at least in part a consequence of the shortcomings of the current Dublin regulation and the failures of attempts to introduce fair responsibility sharing in Europe, end quote. So basically what this piece of evidence is saying is that EU policies have motivated member states to find loopholes to stop accepting these migrants. As we agreed, member states really want to deport Afghans. So they don't want to find out if someone is from Afghanistan. So before they get to that point of having to find out someone is from Afghanistan, before they get to that point of having to keep someone and not being able to deport them, they'll just push them back. They'll refuse to see their asylum application. The affirmative team is increasing this motivation for member states to not want to see their applications, to never want to find out where they're from, because as soon as they find out where they're from, that's when they can't deport them. So you can write down my impact of this as all migrants harmed. That's all migrants harmed. This isn't just a problem for Afghans, this is a problem for any migrant who is trying to come into the EU, because these member states that are already so overwhelmed, these member states that are already trying to deport these Afghans, these member states that don't want any more migrants are going to use this to not have to process these applications. And that's going to mean people from Syria, people from Yemen, people from other dangerous countries won't get a chance for their asylum applications to be heard either. But my second disadvantage, you can write down as lost flexibility. That's lost flexibility. And you can write down my subpoint A under this as limited space. Limited space. Now, according to the concept of non-refoulement, you can't deport someone to a country that is dangerous. But if we think of all of the dangerous countries in the world and all of the people in danger in the world, it is literally physically impossible for the EU to take in everyone who is in danger in the world right now. They have a limited amount of space and a limited amount of people that they can take in. And this is really sad. I really, really wish that the EU could take in everyone who was in danger in the world, but it's simply impossible. You can write down my subpoint B as other countries just as dangerous. It's other countries just as dangerous. The affirmative might try to make a justification for their plan that Afghanistan is above and beyond more dangerous than any other country. They talked about how it had more deaths than Syria and Yemen combined. Just like to point out, Syria and Yemen are smaller countries, and the conflicts in them have been different and spread out in different ways. In fact, the Global Peace Index in 2018 said, quote, Syria remains the least peaceful country in the world, a position it has held for the past 5 years, end quote. And this piece of evidence was from a couple of years ago. And Afghanistan might have gone ahead of Syria since then. I'm not sure. But the point is that Syria was labeled the most dangerous for 5 years in a row, and other countries are just as dangerous as Afghanistan and have just as much risk. But you can write down my subpoint C under that point as should protect the migrants in the most danger. Should protect the migrants in the most danger. I wish the EU could take in everyone in danger in the world. They cannot. They have to prioritize the people who are in the most danger, the people who are in the most need of this protection. And that is what the affirmative team is stopping them from doing. We should prioritize the people who, if they are returned, they will have a certainty of death. We should prioritize the people who would be deported to a war zone rather than simply to a place where there's a drought. We should prioritize the people who are in the most danger. And this is what the affirmative team stops us from being able to do. If you look back at my partner's speech, she talked about how in 2018, there was a drought in Afghanistan that actually caused more people to migrate than the conflict. These people are migrating not from the war zone, but for economic reasons. The affirmative team's main contention was that these migrants were being mislabeled as economic migrants instead of given that subsidiary protection. People who are labeled subsidiary protection are people who are fleeing war zones. But this is actually not a mislabeling. These people are fleeing for economic reasons. And although it would be absolutely great if we could protect them, we need to prioritize the people who are in the most danger. But you can write down the impact of this as unable to prioritize. Unable to prioritize. If member states are forced to take in everyone from Afghanistan, if member states are forced to take in everyone else who starts coming once they find out that they can come freely to the EU, if member states are forced to take in all of these people, they won't have room for the other people who really need it. Now, I agree. Some people from Afghanistan absolutely need protection. Some people from Afghanistan, it would be absolutely unjust if we deported them. And that is where that court case comes in. The current system allows us for flexibility. We are developing this flexibility where people who need it most are protected and people who don't need it as much are deported. We need to still be able to bring in people from Syria and Yemen. We need to still prioritize the people who are in the most danger, and we need to allow a flexible system. That is what our system gives you. It gives you a system where the court is able to make sure that countries don't deport someone to places that are the most dangerous. That is what is developing this month. That is what is developing right now, and that is what the affirmative team is ending. Thank you.
All right, if the affirmative speaker is ready.
Already.
Great. And with 3 minutes on the clock, we'll go ahead and get started. First off, congratulations on making it to finals at nationals.
You as well.
Thank you. Now, can member states already do pushbacks under the status quo?
Yes.
Okay, and so if they really didn't want these migrants to even process their asylum claims, they could do that right now, correct?
No, so what you're changing is that if a member state finds out that someone is from Afghanistan, they're not allowed to deport them at all. So member states will be motivated to not find out whether someone is from Afghanistan using pushbacks.
Okay, so we can agree that the EU and its member states protect almost the vast majority of refugees coming from Syria, correct?
Yeah, I'd say so.
Okay, so have we seen a problem like that with the Syrian refugees?
That they're deported?
That they're pushed back before they apply for asylum?
Well, the EU does not have a ban on deporting people to Syria. So if member states think that someone is really going to be safe if they are deported back to Syria, then they can do that. There hasn't been a ban on any country that is absolutely against any EU precedent.
Okay, so your justification for continuing these deportations is that they're just going to be pushed back into border nations surrounding the EU, correct?
Well, that's one of them. We have other justifications, for example, that the current system is getting better, that there's a court case that allows this increased flexibility.
Okay. Now you talked about the Global Peace Index ranking Syria as the most dangerous country in the world. So we can agree that the Global Peace Index is a reliable index to rely upon, correct?
Well, see, I'm sure that they've probably made some updates, and there's other indexes that have labeled Afghanistan higher. I'm not saying that absolutely Syria is the most dangerous country in the world. I'm just saying that there's other countries who are just as dangerous.
Okay, but that source is credible, correct? The Global Peace Index?
Sure.
Okay, awesome. And we can agree that since 2019 and in 2020, they've ranked Afghanistan the most dangerous country in the world.
That sounds right.
Okay.
But I'm saying that Afghanistan isn't leaps and bounds beyond more dangerous than Syria.
Have you or your partner read any evidence that some other country is on the same scale as Afghanistan?
Well, Syria was top of this list for 5 years. I don't think it was reversed in 1 year.
Okay, we'll talk about that a little bit later. Now, your lack of flexibility point is that we're going to have to accept less other migrants because we're accepting Afghans?
Basically, yeah. So we have a limited amount of space, a limited amount of people that we can take in. And with the increase in Afghan migrants, we won't be able to take in the people who most need it.
Okay. You talked about how we should protect those who are coming from war zones, not just from a drought. We can agree that Afghanistan is in a civil war right now.
There are some war zones in Afghanistan, but like we said at one point in 2018, more people were fleeing for economic reasons than from the war zone.
Okay, and again, that was in 2018, correct? Not with the US and NATO pulling out in 2021, now with Germany and other EU nations pulling out. Afghanistan is a war
So
zone.
the deportations that you're talking about that are a problem, a lot of those deportations were probably from people who came over in 2018.
Last question. We can agree that we read evidence that many of these Afghan migrants simply flee back to the European Union, correct?
Sure.
Okay, great.
The negative team will not be taking any prep time. I have 5 minutes on my timer, and I'll get started. Judges, I'd like to start off the speech by clarifying how we believe you should make this decision at the end of this debate round. Danielle and I believe that if the affirmative team proves that a substantial, tangible advantage will come as a result of passing their plan, you should vote for the affirmative team. However, we also believe that the affirmative team has not and cannot prove a substantial, tangible advantage as a result of their plan. Today, I'll be responding to Thadian's last speech, but I'd like to just start off by clarifying that. He talked about how Afghanistan is perilous, there are more deaths in Syria and Yemen, it's the most dangerous country, and there are many civilian casualties. I have a couple responses to this. My first response is Afghanistan is very large. Afghanistan is very large, and it might seem like a very unimportant point, a sort of technicality, but it really has some substantial impacts. Why? Because even though there's a war in Afghanistan, because Afghanistan is such a physically large country, and 32 million people are actually living in Afghanistan right now, there's not all of Afghanistan can physically be a war zone at the same time with bombings across the entire landmass of Afghanistan. I'd like to clarify that their argument about more deaths in Syria and Yemen was actually talking about war deaths, just war deaths in general, not talking specifically about civilian deaths as well. This is also, again, put this in context with the fact that 2/3 of Syria's population has already fled the country. So Syria and Yemen are in a very different situation. Their violence, it's so violent that most civilians have actually already fled. So Afghanistan is one of those few countries, given that it's farther away, more people still stay in Afghanistan. Again, Afghanistan is so large, many people can live in peace. That's why they're fleeing for economic reasons and not because of violence. Which leads me to my response to his argument regarding still deporting. He said that even though the court ruling was in place, they'd still be deporting and that was still a problem. My first response is many fleeing for economic reasons. Now, the fundamental affirmative team logic breaks down in the fact that if I flee a country for economic reasons and I get deported back to the exact same place I was before, the only reason I would flee again is for economic reasons unless something fundamentally changed and I'm now fleeing due to conflict. If somebody is living in a very rural part of Afghanistan, apart from the war zone, and they flee for economic reasons, and you deport them back to the exact same place they were before, they still won't be fleeing because of conflict. This is fundamentally true. They talked about how our evidence, and this was kind of discussed in cross-examination, is from 2018. Again, many of the people very likely being deported to Afghanistan right now are from the economic situation in 2018. It takes a couple years to actually have your asylum application processed. This is totally within the timeline that we're looking at right now. My second response is protecting those fleeing violence. Protecting those fleeing violence. Now, we talked a little bit about how if you're fleeing you're fleeing an economic situation and you get sent back, that's not necessarily an actual problem, even if there is a war zone in a different part of the very, very large country you live in. But furthermore, the EU Court of Justice case that we brought up is fundamentally important because it's protecting those fleeing violence. The argument we bring up regarding economic migrants is to fundamentally differentiate the people fleeing Afghanistan into the people fleeing economic situation and the people fleeing violence. We agree that the people fleeing violence with a legitimate asylum application should be granted international protection. The affirmative team has never proven that the people being deported have had their asylum applications unjustly rejected. Again, that court case is narrowing the scope of member states, saying that, again, enforcing that principle of non-refoulement and saying that member states have to keep and protect people fleeing legitimate conflict and violence. People fleeing economic conflict, if sent back, will not be in danger. That's how it works, and we've shown you that many people are fleeing economic violence, an economic situation rather than conflict. Again, in 2018, 250,000 people fled due to economic reasons. This is a not insubstantial group of people. They talked about how the JDMC worsens the situation. My response is no evidence of harm after implementation. Now, to be clear, while the deal was signed I think at the end of last year, it hasn't actually been fully implemented. So we can't actually physically know how the implementation will all work out. They cited the evidence of some humanitarian groups saying that they think it will be bad, but again, there's no evidence after the implementation of this new plan of a substantial harm. Thank you.
The affirmative side will take prep time starting at 3 minutes, 48 seconds.
Stopping affirmative prep time at 1 minute and 4 seconds.
All right, excellent. Now, one last time for me, Miss Say and Miss Miller, are you two ready?
Yes.
Excellent. And all 5 of our judges? Perfect. And we have 5 minutes on the clock, so I believe we can go ahead and get started. Quote, "We should protect the migrants in the most danger," end quote. These words were uttered by Miss Danielle Miller just a few moments ago. It's because I agree with her that I believe you should pass an affirmative ballot. But let's go to the point right above that on your flow, which is that she said that other countries are just as dangerous. I actually think her point responds to her own previous contention. We should protect the migrants in the most danger. Statistical analysis proves that Afghanistan is the country that is the most dangerous. Thus, the argument that other countries are just as dangerous or just a bit less dangerous falls moot. The affirmative team has the responsibility to choose a granular policy which we can actually achieve. Not just stopping deportations to every country in the world, but stopping deportations to a country which is statistically proven and found to be the most dangerous in the world. Follow Miss Danielle Miller's own words. We should protect the migrants in the most danger. But here I'd like to make a quick note before I jump into some of my other major contentions, which is that we looked at the back of our table and found that we actually don't have the methodology for the Institute of Economics and Peace evidence. However, we have the methodology for a June 2021 study which cited and corroborated their findings. If the negative team would like that, we can absolutely show that to you. What we do know is that the Institute for Economics and Peace study was one that was holistic, that took into account civilian casualties, corruption, and a wide array of different statistics within the country. Moving forward as well to another brief note, I said that we would provide the negative team with evidence that the own group that they cited, Pro-Azil, actually supports our plan. My partner actually already read it for you. It might be tagged under the European Council for Refugees and Exiles. Pro-Azil is a part of that group, which advocated just this year in 2021 for our plan. With that being cleared, I want to move to a critical contention, which you can entitle Most Perilous. Now, this is a very critical argument within today's round. The negative team had said Afghanistan is certainly not the most dangerous. But let's dive into some subpoints. Firstly, subpoint A, empirical analysis. The affirmative team has provided studies, arguments from different governmental agencies, experts, academia. They all prove one critical thing. Afghanistan is the most dangerous country in the world. Let's look at the U.S. Department of State just this year. As of just a few days ago, the U.S. Department of State published that no part of Afghanistan is safe. Even further, Hardin Lang, who's a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, a former fellow there, wrote just a few days ago on June 11th of 2021, quote, "European countries have a responsibility to act. Europe will need to change its course, suspend deportations, and open its doors to Afghan asylum seekers. A first step would be for European leaders to acknowledge what their troops know. Afghanistan is not safe for return, not any part of it," end quote. Now, I actually want to turn to a piece of argumentation from the negative side. They actually said that Afghanistan's big, thus there can be more parts that are kind of less dangerous. My response can be subpoint B, intensity broad. The point that Afghanistan is big actually helps the affirmative side. It's a huge country with huge levels of violence. If it's the most dangerous country in the world, and statistical evidence proves that every part of Afghanistan, as my partner has cited, is dangerous, that means that it is even more intense. The fighting extends throughout all of the thousands of miles or hundreds of miles of Afghanistan. From Mazar-e-Sharif all the way to Kabul, every part of Afghanistan is unsafe. Now, with that cleared, I want to move to another contention, that of laws, lives, and logic ignored. I know that's long, but laws, lives, and logic ignored. The European Union is currently ignoring laws, lives, and logic. Firstly, subpoint A. We already have this established. There is a legal and moral obligation that the EU has to these migrants. The legal requirements have been very unaddressed by the negative side. This still stands. Non-refoulement is illegal. But then I want to turn to another point under this. Non-refoulement is applicable, and it applies to those who are economic migrants or otherwise. You can tag my response as protected regardless. I'll have some sub-subpoints here. Firstly, sub-subpoint 1, non-refoulement is absolute. The negative team actually never responded to the piece of evidence that says that non-refoulement applies to migrants regardless of their status, regardless of whether they're economic migrants, refugees, or asylum seekers. It applies. It applies, in fact, to all of our judges today, myself and my partner. It is a right for migration. But then secondly, sub-subpoint 2, fall of 2019 and 2021. We have more recent evidence that these migrants are fleeing from violence, the most dangerous places in the world. In fact, 98.04% of migrants in Afghanistan, as of a study published just 2 weeks ago in June, have experienced violence since their return to Afghanistan. Their evidence never once specifies that this drought is what's causing migration in 2021. Perhaps it did in 2018, but they've never read evidence that that's happening in 2021. Further, they said that our plan lessens flexibility. I'd like to turn back to justification 3 within the facts of our case today. Justification 3 provides that this is a cyclical policy. In fact, according to that same study just 2 weeks ago, 98.04% of migrants return to Afghanistan, leave yet again, perhaps en route to the EU or other countries along the way. That means that this is a cyclical policy, meaning that those very same member states have to process people over and over again. Flexibility is uninsured already in the status quo. For these reasons, we would firmly urge an affirmative ballot. Thank you.
The negative team will be taking our remaining 1 minute and 24 seconds of prep time starting now.
No further prep time needed. We have 5 minutes on the clock. Let's get started with this last negative speech. Our fundamental goal should be to protect the people who need the most protecting. The affirmative team's plan makes a large generalization across an entire country. The current system allows us for a flexible system that prioritizes the people who are most in danger. It is because of this that I urge you to prefer the current system. In this last speech, I'm not going to be covering every argument that was brought up in today's debate round. Instead, I'm just going to be looking at the ones that I think should sway your vote. My first main argument you can write down as flexible system. That's flexible system. In the current system, we have a flexible system set up so that if someone is labeled as an economic migrant, that they can be deported. But if someone is labeled as coming from a war zone, being in severe risk of their life, or being in severe risk based off of discrimination and persecution, for example, but as fits the refugee definition, they cannot be deported. This is the system that we have in place right now. And of course, this system has been abused. I absolutely agree with that. But with more recent enforcement, the EU has shown that they are able to enforce this flexible system and make it fair for Afghans. In their last speech, they responded to our court case by saying that Pro-Azul, that was the humanitarian organization that specifically said that this court case would bring justice to Afghans, actually supported their plan. They said this was in 2021. My response you can write down as June court case. That's June court case. This court case was around 2 weeks ago. Unless they can show you that Pro-Azul still supports their plan and with evidence that was less than 2 weeks ago, then they actually haven't proven their point. Pro-Azul specifically said that there has been injustice against Afghans and where they are sent back, and that this fixes that problem. I'd like to look at that piece of evidence just one more time. Pro-Azul specifically said that, quote, it welcomed the ECJ ruling as groundbreaking as it means that Afghan nationals from some provinces may be more likely to be granted protection in the future. The previous case law in Germany never did justice to the situation in Afghanistan. Now, since the ECJ ruling, it will, end quote. So what this piece of evidence is saying is not that it will end all deportations to Afghanistan. That's never been our contention. Instead, it says that it will end deportations to some of the most dangerous provinces. And what's really interesting to note here is that this humanitarian organization specifically defended this as bringing justice to Afghans, not ending all deportations as bringing justice to Afghans, but ending them flexibly. They talked about how the Department of State said that no part of Afghanistan is safe. The maritime response as travel. The Department of State, when it makes these designations, is usually talking about travel. I would assume that this was for this case as well. Travel to Afghanistan, especially for a Westerner, is kind of a different situation. You can write down my subpoint A under this flexible system point as more effective. That's more effective. The affirmative team has already agreed that member states are breaking EU law, that they have, when they are able to find a loophole to break EU law and when they have the motivation to break EU law, that they do so. We allow a more effective system for the Court of Justice to enforce this flexibly. It has shown that it will, and it will continue to if you don't pass the affirmative team's plan. My second main argument you can write down as encouraging abusive loophole. That's encouraging abusive loophole. Again, I'd like to go back to all of those admissions from the affirmative team. We agree that the current system is illegal. They have not shown you that they can change this under our plan. In fact, they said that the reason that they are able to break this law is because of these loopholes of labeling Afghanistan a safe country, which, of course, as we agree, is not right. Many parts of Afghanistan are very dangerous. So if they were able to get it through with this loophole, they will still be able to promote the loophole of these pushbacks that are a widespread policy across the EU. The affirmative team's really only response to this was that pushbacks were already happening, even though people were coming from Syria. You can write down a response as unprecedented ban. That's unprecedented ban. The EU has never banned deportations to one specific nationality. This means that once a member state figures out where you're from, they won't be able to deport you. This means that they have an encouragement to not find out where you're from, to not process you, and to push back all migrants. This is hurting more migrants than just Afghans. But my third and final main point, you can write down as problem being solved. That's problem being solved. We have seen through the JDMC, which specifically cites the principle of non-refoulement, and we have seen through this court case that has been able to implement this flexibly, that the affirmative team's problem that they presented to you has been acknowledged by the EU. And very recently, this past month, when the JDMC was published and when the court case happened less than 2 weeks ago, the EU is ready to address this, and they're ready to address it flexibly and without the abusive loopholes that the affirmative team causes. Thank you.
The affirmative side will take 1 minute and 4 seconds of prep time. No further prep time remaining. All right. If the negative team is ready one last time.
Yes.
Okay, great. Then with 5 minutes on the clock, we'll go ahead and get started. Because we believe that the European Union should not deport vulnerable migrants in a violation of EU law and an irresponsible policy, we would ask you to vote for the affirmative side. In this last affirmative rebuttal of today's debate round, I'll be responding to the major contentions brought by the negative side through 3 key voting issues, or reasons why an affirmative ballot is warranted. We're going to look at the problem, the plan, and the potential, and ultimately explain why our plan is needed and why it will work and be beneficial. So let's go into the first voting issue, that of the problem. What is the problem that we see in the status quo? Subpoint A, empirically proven.
empirically proven. Throughout today's debate round, the negative side has tried to contend that Afghanistan is at least as unsafe as some other nations, that some other nations need it. And further, that there are tons of economic migrants and they don't actually deserve protection. It's important to understand that when we look to the Institute for Economic and Peace, when we look to Dr. Friedrich Stallman, a leading Afghanistan expert, when we look to experts, when we look to the State Department, they all conclude Afghanistan is unsafe in all its areas, where Afghanistan is the most dangerous country in the world, the highest civilian casualties. There has been no counter evidence from the negative side that says Afghanistan is a safe nation. That has been proven in today's debate rounds. Further, they never contested that it's a violation of international law and EU law to deport there. The EU is currently violating EU law by deporting these migrants. This leads to subpoint B, failing system. Failing system. Now, their first voting issue was that of a flexible system, a system that helps to protect migrants by reviewing them on a case-by-case basis. But the reality is they've ignored the fact that these member states, as explained in our 1AC, are misdefining Afghanistan as safe and deporting those who should be protected. And further, not once have they responded to our contention that non-refoulement, that protection applies to any migrants. So even those who come with economic intentions, they are not allowed to be deported to an unsafe nation. And as we've proven Afghanistan is unsafe, economic migrants, if that is true, because their evidence is from 2018, not 2021, they are still protected under this principle, and it is a violation of EU law to deport them regardless. That has been a contention that has been entirely dropped by the negative side. This failing system does not help protect migrants, but simply lets them through. Further, talking about the JDMC, again, the evidence that they talked about was entirely contradicted by my evidence that said it actually makes it easier to violate these migrants' rights. But further, they responded to my evidence by saying, well, this is the purpose, not actually after it's been signed and used. Well, I would say the same thing about their evidence. That was the purpose of the JDMC by the commission, who was the organization signing the JDMC. Obviously a biased source, but further, not actual evidence that it's been protecting migrants. So this is a failing system. Reform is necessary. But then turning to the pro-asylum point, their evidence says that pro-asylum says it is more likely that these migrants will be protected. And further, even if that one court case for Germany solved the issue entirely, that's 1 out of 27 member states. Our plan is needed. So what do we do? This leads to voting issue 2, the plan. The plan. Subpoint A, loophole eliminated. The way that member states violate and circumvent EU law right now is because EU law only bans deporting to an unsafe nation. So they misdefine Afghanistan as safe. Under our plan, we take away that right to do that. We don't just deport a vague idea of unsafe nations, but we ban deportations to a specific nation. But subpoint B is contradictory contentions. Contradictory intentions. Now, they made the contention in voting issue 1 that the Court of Justice is able to enforce this flexible system that protects migrants. But then they talked about how these member states are pushing back these migrants and not protecting them. How in one case is the Court of Justice able to enforce EU law and protect migrants, and then in the other case, the Court of Justice is completely helpless to enforce EU law and not protect migrants from pushbacks? These are contradictory claims. Either migrants are being protected in the current system or they aren't. The reality is we would contend that they are. This leads to my final voting issue, the potential. What happens when you pass our plan? Subpoint A, migrants benefited. Migrants benefited. Going back to that loophole of member states may push back these migrants. Really, that contention is non-unique. And the fact that member states could already be doing that if they did not want to process these asylum claims. We can look to the example of Syria. The vast majority of Syrians, around 85%, are accepted for asylum. And yet, we've not seen vast pushbacks of Syrian refugees. That point has not been proven. But further, it's not a justification to continue deporting migrants back to the most dangerous nation in the world. But further, this leads to subpoint B, EU better. EU better. They never responded to our third justification, that these deportations are simply a cyclical process. The EU spends millions of euros to deport these migrants back to the most dangerous country in the world. Because it's the most dangerous country in the world, they flee back to the EU or other nations. These deportations are cyclical. And further, according to Dr. Yuri Dadouche, as explained in our 1AC, it is not in the economic interest of the EU to deport these migrants. The reality is this is a policy that harms both migrants and the European Union. Because the EU should not continue to ignore lives, laws, and logic, we would ask you to vote for the affirmative side and suspend deportations to Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you to all of our judges for your time. We really appreciate it. And thank you to Betty and Zacharias for a great debate round.
Yeah, well done, guys.
Well done. And thank you to all of our judges.
Yes, thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.